But on this occasion, it's not Donald, but in fact his son, who's causing the latest stir in the Western media. Reports suggest that Trump Jr. has been discussing, quote, ways to cooperate with Russia to end the conflict in Syria. The conversation came during private talks in Paris last month at an event for diplomats, business leaders and politicians. RT spoke to the event's co-host, Randa Kassis, who's also a Syrian opposition group leader.
I had a chance to talk to Donald Jr. at a dinner. We discussed Syria and exchanged some ideas on how to find a political solution and reach agreements between Russia and the US over the issue. It seemed to me that Mr. Trump Jr. was pragmatic enough and can evaluate the complexity of the Syrian conflict. It's good that he is aware of the fact that we cannot have a political solution without an agreement with Russia. We need to start a real political process and an agreement between the US and Russia. Unfortunately, the Obama administration has always led a double game. Even when Kerry was willing to separate the armed but so-called moderate opposition from the extremist insurgents, even when he was agreeing with Russia and with us to separate the opposition, he wasn't doing anything when he came back home. We need to get real. Bashar Assad is not the main problem at the moment. The main thing is how we can begin the real changes to the system and the regime. We don't know all of the people who will be in the US administration, but I'm hopeful, because some of them want to destroy Islamism like we do.
Well, throughout the armed conflict in Syria, the Obama administration has been supporting opposition groups there, despite them having links to extremists in some cases. The rise of terrorist groups was instead blamed on President Assad, with US diplomats claiming there would be no future for the country if he's part of any political transition. Washington also severed relations with Russia on Syria after a ceasefire brokered by the two countries failed. Well, it's too early to know what policy the new administration will have on Syria, but Trump's repeatedly called for cooperation between Russia and the US regarding the war on terror.
It would be so great if we could get Russia on our side and other countries on our side and knock the hell out of ISIS.
I believe an easing of tensions and improved relations with Russia from a position of strength only is possible, absolutely possible.
And I would get along with Russia, and I'll get along with Putin, and he's not going to make us look bad anymore. But we're going to get along.
Russia doesn't like ISIS any better than we do. Wouldn't it be nice if we actually got along with Russia and you could knock them out together? Wouldn't that be a good thing, as opposed to, you know, tough talk?
Meanwhile, the topic of Russia also surfaced during the second round of Republican presidential primary debates in France between two of the country's former prime ministers. Alain Juppé and François Fillon are vying for the party's presidential nomination. Recently, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Fillon, a favourite in the race, was a professional and decent politician and that he had developed good relations with him. That comment triggered a backlash from Fillon's rival.
I was a bit surprised to see, for the first time in a debate, I think, in a French political election, that the Russian head of state chooses his candidate. I saw that last night on television, and it surprised me a bit.
What I am asking for is simply that we sit around the table with the Russians, without, by the way, asking for the Americans' approval, and that we try to re-establish ties with them, if not trust, at least something that moors Russia to Europe.
Let's bring in a guest now. Patricia CHAGNON, member of France's National Front Party, joins me on the line. Patricia, your party's been calling for cooperation with Russia. Your party's views, though, repeatedly branded as marginal by the critics, and yet now we're hearing the same kind of rhetoric coming from certain parts of the political establishment in France. What's changing?
What's changing? Yes, well, very good evening. What's changing is that I think we have had a recent vote of Brexit in the UK, and the people in the UK have clearly shown their independence. What's changed also is the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And I think what's changing is that the French people are realizing that what we have always said is that we need closer ties with Russia is absolutely the way to go. What is surprising, however, is the reaction of Mr. Fillon, because let's get back to the reality. Mr. Fillon was the Prime Minister of France when France reinstated as a complete member of NATO in 2009. So it is very surprising that today Mr. Fillon is claiming we need closer ties with Russia, whilst when he was a Prime Minister he actually relinquished French sovereignty by joining NATO as a full member again. What I do draw as a conclusion is the fact that Mr. Fillon must be realizing that the program of Marine Le Pen is the right program, and that yes, we do need to have closer ties with Russia if we want to ban terrorism, if we want to crush ISIS, and if we want to reinstate good trade relationships with Russia, which are today penalizing our agricultural sector.
Do you believe that forces calling for cooperation with Russia can actually win major elections in Europe if you consider how much anti-Russia sentiment there is in the EU?
I'm sorry, the sound is very bad. I couldn't hear your question. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, absolutely no problem. I'm just wondering, do you genuinely believe that political organisations who are calling for cooperation with Russia, that they can still win major elections in Europe when you think about how much anti-Russia sentiment there is in the EU?
I'm not so sure about the anti-Russia sentiment at all, and you know, I have a feeling that many people are looking at establishing better relationship, because many people realize that on our own we're not going to win the war against ISIS and against terrorism, and that Russia can play a very big part in helping us gain those objectives, which are common objectives between our countries. We have very long history that goes back a long time in the past, and it is time that we actually start cooperating in a better way.
Let's imagine, though, maybe not pro-Russia, but a friendly with Russia party gets into power. Would they not immediately face the threat of isolation if it cooperates with Russia? We've seen it in the past. France immediately was put under pressure to pull back on that deal with the Mistral warships with Russia. Wouldn't it just be history repeating itself?
Well, I think we should let things play out and see how things go. Yes, we have to see how things go, but I think a lot has changed on the international scene. As I've said before, I think that the vote of the very courageous British people to take their own destiny in hand, I think the vote in America has shown that the establishment can no longer predict or dictate what countries are going to do. Countries are definitely looking, and people are definitely looking to be more sovereign in their decisions, and that will also mean making sovereign decisions on with who to work on foreign policy.
Donald Trump's repeatedly said during his campaign he wants to work with Russia, certainly in terms of fighting terrorism. His Vice President-elect, though, Mike Pence, has been saying very different things. Let's just have a listen now to what Pence has been saying.
Russia need to be met with American strength. And if Russia chooses to be involved, and continue, I should say, to be involved in this barbaric attack on civilians in Aleppo, the United States of America should be prepared to use military force to strike military targets of the Assad regime.
In a situation like this, where you have the President, the Vice President, in polar opposition in terms of how they view the situation, what kind of approach do you think we'll see from the US administration?
I think that any effort to combat ISIS and terrorism will be welcome and will be backed. However, it is not my position to discuss any relationship between two independent countries, between Russia and the United States. That's entirely up to them. However, yes, if their cooperation can lead to combating terrorism and combating the Islamic State, that is all that we want, and that's all that the people of France want, because the terrorist menace on France at the time being, at this very time, is very heavy, and we suffer from it very much.
Patricia CHAGNON, member of France's National Front Party, is my guest this hour. Many thanks, Patricia. Now, on to other news, and Turkey's leader has warned that he could open his country's borders, enabling migrants to stream their way into the European Union. RT's Peter Oliver has been looking into what prompted President Erdogan's warning.
When 50,000 refugees turned up at the border gate, you said, what will we do when Turkey opens the border gates? Look, if you go further, those border gates will be opened. You should know that.
Well, what's prompted Erdogan's words has been the votes in the European Parliament over the last week. The sessions in Strasbourg have seen EU parliamentarians vote in a majority to say that they want to freeze membership talks of Turkey with the EU. The response from Ankara has been to say that there is the potential that they could open borders with the EU to the over 2.5 million refugees that are currently living in Turkey. This back and forth has been going on since the summer. We did hear that because Turkey may be offered a visa liberalisation deal, as it was called, an open visa deal allowing Turkish citizens to move into the Schengen zone for tourist visas, that there would be a deal allowing those refugees that had a limited chance of asylum in Europe being returned back to Turkey. That seems almost dead and gone right now. What we did see, though, is it started off with a very good relationship between particularly Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU Commission President, and President Erdogan, and particularly between Europe and Turkey. It started off so well. It's really gone a little bit downhill of late.
While Turkey is under attack from terrorism directly and indirectly from all corners of the country and by all the terror organisations and their sponsors, the EU is telling us to change our counter-terror law in exchange for visas.
If President Erdogan decides to deny the Turks the right to free travel to Europe, then he must explain this to the Turkish people. It will not be my problem, it will be his problem.
The death penalty can be discussed by the relevant institutions according to the Constitution, and a decision may be taken.
No country can become an EU member state if it introduces that penalty.
Well, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel had long been a big proponent in Europe of this this refugee return deal with Turkey. Now, we understand that her spokespeople have spoken about this response from Ankara, saying that it was hardly helpful and that talk was really what was needed, not these type of threats. Well, if Turkish and European relations continue to degrade as we've seen them over the last week, in fact, then of course it could become a major issue across Europe, and particularly right here in Germany, where of course we have a federal election coming up next year in 2017.
The International and European Federations of Journalists have slammed an EU resolution to counteract perceived Russian propaganda as totally irresponsible. We'll have more on that story after this short break.
And these are the stories we are tracking for you today.
I think that the euro is severely undervalued.
That's the highest output in over 3 years. What the Fed really wants is inflation.
The U.S. has more than doubled imports from Iraq.
All that debt that was accumulated, they have to pay it off.
And when you see oil go down, our economy goes down.
What do you make of that data, and what does it really mean for the average worker?
I'm Tom Hartman, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture. And when you question more, you find what you're looking for. We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
Welcome back. The international and European federations of journalists have slammed an EU non-legislation resolution to counteract perceived Russian propaganda. They're calling it totally irresponsible. The resolution targets, among other things, Russian media outlets such as Sputnik News Agency and RT.
It is totally irresponsible to equate counteracting Russia with the resistance to the Daesh terrorist group. The EFJ don't believe that censorship, harassment and demonisation are the right answers to counter so-called propaganda. The main flaw of this text is its confusion and its lack of coherence. It is irresponsible to mix up Russian media with Kremlin-controlled media. The report confuses strategic communication, state propaganda, terrorist propaganda, counter-propaganda and independent information. This is typical of the Cold War climate that's numbing Europe.
Well, the resolution draws a parallel between what it calls Russian strategic communication and ISIL terrorist propaganda. The resolution branded some Russian outlets as the most dangerous tools of hostile propaganda. Let's discuss this in more depth now and cross to Philippe Leroux, who is from the European Federation of Journalists. Philippe, what is going on? Why was this resolution discussed in the first place, never mind passed?
I really couldn't know this, but I noticed this resolution was highly controversial, as only 44% of the MPs voted in favour. There were many abstentions, which shows there was a big discussion, but we couldn't really understand this.
But, I mean, what exactly is the fear? Am I right now warping the fragile minds of European viewers? What do they worry about?
No, we really don't believe that you can counter propaganda because they say there is propaganda. I shouldn't say this, but if there is propaganda, don't fight this with propaganda. We believe, like we said, in ethical journalism, in media literacy, and in responsible journalism, and not that way.
The word propaganda gets thrown around an awful lot. Was there any evidence or a description of what propaganda is, or did they give any examples of how the Russian media isn't telling the truth?
No, we really had no. I couldn't say on what it was based. So I mean, at least when you name a media by name, which is highly unusual, first of all, you should give them the right to defend themselves, and second, you should show exactly what you mean by saying they're doing propaganda.
Yeah, as you said, it's hard to defend yourself when there isn't actually a clear accusation made. What about the timing? Why do you think this initiative would be discussed at this particular moment in time?
Well, we find it very unfortunate because, as we said, the International Federation of Journalists, which I am chairing for June this year, and its European branch, have been working on dialogue between Russian and so-called, well, let's say, Western journalists. There were several meetings that year, and the last one will be held in Moscow in December with the support of the EU delegation in Russia. So it's very difficult to understand why the European Parliament took this initiative, which is jeopardizing this dialogue.
The actual resolution itself was fascinating.